All right. This is your first of about 5 sets of notes on the People's Republic of China. We'll break this first lecture into 2 parts. We'll talk about the creation of the modern Chinese state, and we'll kind of focus on the end of dynastic ruling with a little bit of philosophical background in terms of things that influenced philosophy around the Cultural Revolution and the rise of Mao. And that'll be the bulk of this first lecture. The second lecture will talk about really post-Cultural Revolution China. We'll look at the impact of Deng Xiaoping on the kind of creation of China as we know it today. The third part will look at political institutions. The fourth part will look at issues facing citizens, and then the fifth and final lecture will kind of be a cross-cutting of contemporary political issues in China. As we've done at the beginning of each country, we probably should have some sort of a discussion as to why studying China is important, and why it might be one of the 6 nations chose by the College Board when they crafted the curriculum. Really, China has kind of a unique history of dynastic rule to a short-lived democratic revolution to the installation of the communist state, and then dealing with how China should kind of manage itself, or how it should continue to operate in a world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China is one of 5 firmly communist nations that exist in the world today. The other remaining nations are North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and Laos. You see other nations that have more democratic socialist trends. You see nations that still utilize elements of a Soviet-style or communist-style political command structure, but in terms of a true one-party communist rule, it's definitely just China, plus the other 4. China also kind of rides an interesting line of maintaining state-run socialism, still using elements of command economic control, but also with some pivots toward capitalism. And in some of our discussions at the beginning of the semester, we talked about kind of a correlation between liberalism and capitalism. And China is successfully kind of a break from this model of using, authoritarian structures with, a huge capitalist kind of engine of their economy. So, kind of 3 things that we'll talk about throughout China conceptually will be, will there be any push for democratization? Do people want more democratization in a world of strong economic success? We'll look and see if global pressure can eliminate Chinese human rights issues that they tend to get a lot of flack for from the global community. And the last thing we'll kind of look at is the rise of Xi Jinping, the current Chinese president who has been in charge since 2013. We'll kind of look at things done by him over time. When we talk about China's flag, there are kind of a couple of interesting symbolic items. The red on the flag denotes the revolution, and we'll talk about the symbolism of the rise of Red China. When we talk about the yellow and the stars there to stand out against the red. The largest star kind of denotes the Chinese Communist Party, which becomes the main focus of all things in modern China. And the 4 smaller stars represent the Chinese people and the quest to be unified under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. On the next slide, we have a video that comes from an organization that's changed its name 3 times in the last 2 years. So they're Test Tube News, Seeker Daily, or apparently they're now this. But we hear a lot of people talk about modern China being this big, scary military and economic entity. And this video, in about 3 minutes, kind of talks about why China may or may not be as powerful as we seem to think it is. I would definitely watch this video on your time, and you'll have the link to it through the slides on Classroom. And we'll kind of see if we think that their analysis of modern China is right. So when we talk about China geographically, like we've done with the previous countries that we've studied, we'll kind of talk about geographically. We know that their official title is the People's Republic of China, and it's everything on the map that we see, including the green autonomous regions, including Taiwan, which we'll talk about. But the People's Republic of China denotes all of these kind of unified under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. When you see people talk about the Republic of China, they can be talking about one of 2 different entities. The Republic of China is a referent to what pre-communist China was referred to as, but in a more contemporary fashion, people utilize the Republic of China as the formal name of Taiwan. And in the 5th kind of part of this lecture series is where we will really get our hands dirty in terms of talking about the modern throwdown between China and Taiwan. Geographically speaking, it's the 4th largest country in the world. It's about 9.5 million square miles, and less than 15% of that land is either suitable for or used for agricultural purposes, and we'll talk about why that matters again later. While they're the 4th largest geographically, they are the largest in terms of population, of around 1.3 billion. And one of the things that we'll look at again in the 5th lecture is the growth and contraction, and the growth and the contraction of China's population in the kind of guise of, is something like a Chinese one-child policy necessary? China is kind of broken up administratively into different labels that lead to different types of control. There are 23 provinces in China. There are 5 autonomous regions. There are 4 centrally administered regions, and then 2 special autonomous regions. When we talk about the autonomous regions, and those are the 4 regions that show up in green, these are units that are equivalent to that of a province, but they tend to be large pockets of ethnic minorities. So when we talk about like the Tibet as a autonomous region, we'll talk about, the problems that Tibetans face as both an ethnic and a religious minority. When we talk about the Xinjiang province up in the northwest corner of China, that's where like the Uyghurs live, which is a large pocket of Chinese Muslims. Where the autonomous regions are special is that they have some autonomy in crafting their own cultural policies, but politically speaking, they are strictly subordinate to the central government in Beijing. When we talk about the special administrative regions, or the SARs, the 2 that show up in red, those are Hong Kong and Macau. They are indirectly ruled by China. These are 2 areas where you tend to see the most westernized elements. The least economic regulation, where the most kind of Western capitalism shows up. These tend to be more autonomous, both politically and economically, especially compared to the provinces or the autonomous regions, and where they tend to be the most limited are foreign affairs and defense. So even though these are areas where kind of Western capitalism is allowed to flourish, their ability to relate with the rest of the world are strictly kind of governed by the government. So when we talk about kind of big elements of Chinese history, we'll talk about what we call kind of critical junctures. And these will be elements of China's history that matter in how it comes to understand modern China. And China has a rich and beautiful history. You can take multiple courses at the collegiate level that kind of break China's history into, several different eras or periods that matter. And we just don't have the time to do a lot of justice to ancient Chinese history. So you need to know that China for a long period of time was under imperial rule, and they were guided by kind of Confucian principles, where Confucius kind of stood for harmony, order, and peace, and these are things that still kind of permeate their way into the political sphere of China today, that order is necessary to maintain everything, and order tends to mean things like obedience to authority, and that's why you tend to see more people kind of follow in lockstep with the Chinese government or Chinese political tradition. And we'll talk about how the obedience to authority that shows up in Confucius's teachings really become timeless in terms of how China approaches things politically. Obedience to authority comes with both a meritocracy and a hierarchy, which are things that, again, are the core of Chinese political organization today. And to kind of uphold these Confucian principles or ethics, there was a civil service created, right? We saw the birth of, a bureaucratic entity that helped maintain harmony, order, and peace. And you had to kind of pass exams based on Confucian ethics. Ethnocentrism is something that also really starts to pop up as a value from Imperial China, that there is a lot of pride in the ethnic traditions of predominantly the Han Chinese, which are, I believe it's 96% of the Chinese population. And when we tend to talk about Chinese people, we tend to be talking in a broad, sweeping sense about Han Chinese. The next slide, again, is a nice kind of little video that summarizes some of the teachings of Confucius, and it will be important for you to kind of understand from this video the influence of Confucius when it gets to the rise of Mao and kind of the Cultural Revolution. So I know I've spoiled the answer to this question a little bit for you, but after you have watched the Confucius video, you should come up with an answer to this. What elements of Confucianism do you think can be found in modern political culture? And I'd like you to pause the video and in your notes kind of, add your musings. So the biggest two that I think are kind of the best answer to the question of how Confucius influences modern Chinese political culture is the notion of kind of obedience to authority, of following rule in the name of harmony and order. And again, this will kind of be important when we want to compare China to other nations and ask the question, why do we not see a stronger will or push for elements of liberal democracy? And the answer is a long-standing tradition of obedience to higher power, higher authority. And again, the second element, kind of serving the first, is the use of hierarchical structures, which will kind of explain why, when we look at the Chinese political structure in kind of the third set of lecture notes, as to how that really matters. So when we start looking at elements of kind of non-dynastic rule, we're gonna look at a period of time that leads to the birth of the Republic of China, which then leads to the birth of the People's Republic of China. So in 1839 to 1949, China goes through a historical period that's kind of now dubbed as the Century of Humiliation, where you see a lot of economic stagnation, you see huge degrees of poverty for a lot of different reasons. As the modern world is kind of changing around China, as states are being born, you are seeing more pressure from the outside world on China to kind of change and adapt more Western European values. And during this century of humiliation, you kind of see a blow to Chinese cultural values with the end of dynastic rule. And people will kind of talk about the end of dynastic rule in kind of two reasons, or for two different ways. They'll talk about, right, the death of the dynasty kills, a long cultural standing series of values and things like that. But you'll also see people at the time talk about the end of dynastic rule with great degrees of hope, because it leads to a birth of a democratic republic in China. During the Century of Humiliation, you see things like the Opium Wars play their way out. You see some of the devastation carried out from World War II in China, that you just see a lot of things kind of go poorly for them. What really starts to kind of influence the end of the Century of Humiliation will be the first revolution that we'll talk about, from 1911 to 1912. And the father of the Republic of China, and the father of kind of the first revolution, and the one that we tend to forget about because it gets eclipsed by Mao's Cultural Revolution, is Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was an American-educated individual who returns to China to kind of influence change, where we start to see the reason why some things start to change in China is the influence of people coming back, the influence of Western forces, the influence of imperial forces to kind of change the governing philosophy of China. Sun Yat-sen believed in nationalism, right? Kind of taking ethnocentrism as an element of Confucian value and extending that to kind of a pride in a nation. Sun Yat-sen believed in democracy and social welfare, and because of some of these beliefs, he's able to rile up some people who feel like they are wronged during, periods of stagnation and poverty, during the Opium Wars, people being mistreated by the dynastic rulers or by outside forces who are kind of permeating their way into China. So he becomes kind of the mastermind of the first revolution that leads to the creation of the Republic of China. And the problem was, once this revolution kind of starts, there are too many cooks in the kitchen. There are too many people trying to create too much change at once, and Sun Yat-sen cannot really hold power for a long period of time. And actually, the birth of the Republic of China creates a long era of political chaos because you start to see kind of the rule of warlords, and you see kind of warring factions come to be, which again continues this century of humiliation, because the goal of any revolution is the promise of a rebirth, of a change, of a leap forward, and this, tends to be kind of a blow to the people who wanted to preserve China the way it was, because you are ending 2,000 years of, dynastic rule and challenging political, cultural, and ethnic values in the name of a failed revolution. The next clip kind of will explain or explore Sun Yat-sen and kind of the problems facing the Republic of China, if you need some more depth. So, the revolution leads to these warlords, and for a period of time from 1911 to 1949, you see two political powers or parties start vying for power. You see the Nationalist Party, which is the Kuomintang, which was led by Sun Yat-sen, the gentleman we were talking about over the previous slide and from the video you hopefully just watched. And he kind of pushed for a message of resistance, that the Nationalist Party wanted to end foreign influence. They wanted to end some of the less desirable elements of imperialism that they were struggling against. And they wanted to do this in kind of conjunction with more modernization and reform. And the reason why this is important is because at the time, China is about 80% rural, that they're not as developed economically, industrially, etc., compared to the rest of the world. So he wants to resist outside influence, but allow China to be more modern and kind of function like the rest of the world does. And when Sun Yat-sen eventually loses power, he is replaced by Chiang Kai-shek, who is another Chinese ruler that we'll kind of talk about in a later lecture. The second political party that becomes born is the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded in 1921, and this is led by Mao Zedong, who we will talk about at great length throughout this, because there's no one individual who's more influential in modern Chinese history than Chairman Mao. In 1928, the Communist Party was forced to the west and to the cities in the countryside. And if you remember anything about the discussion of Marxism or revolution and the role that played in Russia, you know that people who are in poorer areas that feel disaffected are very kind of susceptible to dealing, or being intrigued by the teachings of kind of a communist philosophy. So you see kind of a wrestle for power between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. And when Chiang took power in 1928, this is when he labels Mao and any of his followers enemies of the state. So this leads to what becomes known as a period of the Long March of China. So this is literally the nationalist forces chasing the communists to try and destroy them. But as the communists are kind of parading around the countryside around Western China, Mao is able to kind of preach a message of, communist promise of the rising of the peasant class to a position of power. And through kind of Chiang Kai-shek pushing Mao to the west and allowing them to kind of build a new base, it has the opposite effect of what Chiang wanted, that Mao becomes more influential, that Mao becomes more powerful, and where this becomes important in the long game is when the communists eventually become successful and the communists remove the nationalists from power. There's already a strong base of individuals who are agreeing with Mao's new revolutionary ideology. Through this, you're also starting to see kind of a long-standing relationship of alliances between families, and this becomes the development of a Chinese principle known as guanxi. Guanxi is like informal political relationships that people can have. It's informal politics that are not necessarily tied to things done by the state, but these relationships can lead to political benefits, as we'll kind of explore later on. From 1941 to 1945, again, we see the communists becoming more successful, that in some clashes between the Chinese and the Japanese, the communists are now gaining some power or some strength because of their dealings with foreign adversaries. And in 1949 is where we see the People's Liberation Army, which is the military base of the Chinese Communist Party, marches into Beijing unopposed, and they establish the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China does not get recognized as an international entity until 1970, where, for the most part, people still recognized the Republic of China's government, the ROC, the nationalists, as legitimate. And when the PLA takes Beijing and the communists take power, the nationalists flee to the island of Taiwan. And again, this creates seeds that will explain the modern elements of the China-Taiwan conflict. So China as we know it officially is born in 1949, but they are not recognized until the 70s by the rest of the international community as the legitimate government of China. So, understanding the rise of Mao is important because as the communists were kind of parading throughout China while they were being chased by the nationalists, they were preaching their own form of communism, and Maoism gets called Maoism once Mao takes power. But there are several kind of crucial values to Maoism, and its kind of permutation of Marx's arguments made in like the Communist Manifesto, or it's different from how like Lenin and Stalin implement a communist playbook in The Birth of Russia. So Maoism is a form of communism that focused, in the strength of the peasant, and it spoke to kind of the rural, poor farming class that the Chinese population was dealing with, and not necessarily like the disaffected industrial worker that were being addressed by Marx or by Lenin's appropriation of Marx. So in strengthening the peasant, there were several kind of philosophical values that were important to Mao, and that the first is collectivism, and this is kind of the tie back to some of the notions of harmony and order kind of taught under Confucius. That, the importance of collectivism is the notion that you should be loyal to the party and to the state rather than your family or your village. That there are things that matter more than your local relationships. That you are smaller pieces in something great, and that your struggle, your strife, the things that you do to empower the whole will be more important than empowering, the sum of the parts. Second is kind of the belief in struggle and activism, that the goal is for the people to kind of embrace that they have to sacrifice. That instead of changing or advocating for things that you need, that your sacrifice is good. And you'll hear me use the phrase struggle a lot, especially as we talk about things being struggled against during the Cultural Revolution. But you had to kind of accept the status quo, and you would get your comeuppance by kind of adhering to the desires of the ruling class. Egalitarianism is kind of the next important value that egalitarianism was kind of to create the notion of equality before the law, that you needed equal roles for men and women, that all people needed to be equal, and in kind of hindsight, people make the argument that the existence of a hierarchical party structure probably denies notions of egalitarianism, but it's something that when you preach to people that you're going to elevate classes who are the most disaffected, being, you know, the women and the poor, that people kind of buy into this. And Mao was, you know, kind of committed to arguing for women's equality, and he actually, you know, is on record saying that women should be treated equally because women hold up half of the heaven. Self-reliance is kind of the last micro value, that the people are in charge of their destiny. This kind of takes some of the message by the nationalists who were kind of preaching anti-imperialism, and, you know, arguing that the people of China were the ones who were in charge of their destiny, that China should be a bit more isolated, and that in their isolation that they could rebuild a stronger China in its image. And then the last kind of value is the mass line, and I think I would argue that this is the most important political principle under Maoism, because it really shows why authoritarianism, or kind of the hierarchical structure that comes to be, is very effective. So the argument is that through this notion of the mass line, the leaders will communicate their will or the direction to the people, and the people could communicate their wisdom to leaders, which sounds great. That it's a two-way street, that the people can influence the leadership can dictate the will of the people. But how this kind of becomes implemented in Mao's China is that the mass line is that everybody in the ruling class is on the same page, that no one challenges Mao or the party. And it's similar to kind of the notion of the collective responsibility that we talk about with a parliamentary system, or kind of the notion of a prime minister's rule in the UK, that the mass line ultimately becomes used as kind of a way of, yes, increasing political channels, but really increasing the control and the wisdom of the party, and how it's kind of spread upon people. If you're interested in kind of looking at some differences between Maoism and Marxism and other communist or socialist models, definitely watch this video. Some of it's kind of silly, some of it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's one of the best kind of side-by-side comparisons of this political and economic philosophy that we tend to believe is the same from person to person, to country, but they're very, very different. So under Maoism, from 1949 to 1957, we really see him try to implement the Soviet model, that while there was a rejection of external imperial values, there was kind of the belief that, hey, this communist experiment is working in Russia, that it has preceded the rise of the CCP in in China that we should kind of hijack parts of their playbook. And the USSR was kind of offering assistance to China, and China was willing to sacrifice things back to Russia, which will create some problems that we'll talk about later. So, using this Soviet model, we can kind of look at two areas of reform and then kind of an embracing of the 5-year plan that we talked about during the Russia unit. So the first was land reform, and you see a redistribution of property from the rich to the poor to give people more of that sense of ownership, that sense of entitlement to the land, that people will have theirs. And this really increased levels of productivity in the countryside, that people were able to produce more because they felt like they had more of a stake in creating things in the name of benefiting the one greater China. In terms of civil reform, you saw kind of a big quest to end opium addiction after the Opium Wars in the late 1800s. Which is something that really kind of permeated through parts of the early 1900s. If you want to read a good kind of fictional account of some of the very real problems facing China, you should read The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck. That kind of looks at how opium kind of ravaged elements of China during the time in a way that we're kind of dealing with an addiction problem to opiates and opioids in the United States today. And he does kind of make good in enhancing the role of women in society, of increasing rights for women in society as well. Then you start seeing kind of the birth of the 5-year economic and political development model, where you are seeing a nationalization of industry, where you are seeing a more command economic structure take place in the name of the state being able to produce, and if the state has more, the state can redistribute more to people lower, in lower socioeconomic classes. You see an eventual collectivization of agriculture, so kind of eliminating some of the land reform talked about at the top of this slide, and then an eventual ban on private property and kind of an embracing of the commons, which will have a nasty side effect that we'll talk about with some problems here in a few. So one of the things that I think we can start doing, especially knowing that we're going to have to deal with some of these comparative forms of questioning on the AP exam, is to be able to kind of compare and contrast the rise of communism in China to the rise of communism in Russia, and then be able to compare and contrast Maoism to Marxism or Leninism in the Soviet Union. So pause the video, come up with your answer to this, and then I'll kind of talk through my thoughts at the end. Okay, so in comparing the rise of communism in China and Russia, we can really kind of find two noticeable differences. Russia, we had the Bolshevik Revolution, right? You had a communist uprising that overthrew the Tsar, that the communists existed before the revolution, created revolution, installed new controls after revolution successful. In China, it had to be a lot more of an organic process, that you were seeing kind of a ideological throwdown between the nationalists and the communists, and that the communists had to win over the people, right? That during the Long March, they were winning over the peasant class throughout Western and Central China by helping defeat Japan in World War II. The communists gained kind of more clout that way, and then the end point of the Chinese Civil War, they defeat the nationalists and force them to flee to Taiwan. So they garnered a lot more organic support over time and had kind of more proof by challenging kind of the democratic ideology of the nationalists. If you want to compare Maoism to Marxism or Leninism, there are several similarities. First is kind of that belief in democratic centralism, that the party knows best, that the party will be looking out for the people, that you as an individual matter, but the people as a whole matter more. You see kind of collectivization and the nationalization of industry, kind of the use of these command economic structures that we associate with communism and socialism. In terms of differences, Mao definitely wanted to empower the peasant more, that as we talk about the Cultural Revolution over the next couple of slides, people who were intellectuals and artists and, cultured individuals were kind of frowned upon because they didn't know what it was like to struggle or to deal with strife, and that Mao really thought the people who had to deal with suffering on a more regular basis would be kind of more suitable to create the change that he wanted. And then the mass line is something that also becomes a huge difference, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more during the Cultural Revolution, or the institution of kind of the Chinese government. So under Maoism, right, as the communists become a little bit stronger, they really start to question whether or not their relationship with Russia or the USSR at the time was productive. And they were really thinking that there was more take from Russia than give from Russia. So during a period of time from 1958 to 1966 that's known as the Great Leap Forward, we really see kind of this push away of external forces again, where China wanted to be different and separate from Russia. So you started to see all around economic development, where there was now equal emphasis on both industrialization and agricultural production. And this becomes important because if they can produce everything they need industrially and agriculturally on their own, then they don't need to turn to the rest of the world for anything else. The Great Leap Forward was kind of Mao's grand utopic vision to create this radical egalitarian society where everybody was equal, everybody had what they needed, and they could get from communities to then strengthen the nation. So in the name of kind of these communities that became economically self-sufficient and this newfound focus on industrialization and agricultural production, you're now starting to see things like backyard furnaces where people are turning to their own forms of like steel milling and production of raw materials in their backyards, and in kind of the name of meeting production goals and also trying to be as self-sustaining as humanly possible. You see the notion of mass mobilization to deal with anything where you can kind of turn your sheer number of population into a strength. And you see kind of the birth of the clash between the red versus the expert. That you wanted party workers running the government. You wanted the peasants who were elevated running the government. You wanted the people who had dealt with struggle dealing with the government, not bureaucrats. And this is kind of a trend that we're seeing in contemporary populism, right? Donald Trump is, successfully campaigned on the notion of draining the swamp, of getting more people with less political expertise in to really try and change the notion of what it means to govern. And that's what you saw kind of Mao implement during the Great Leap Forward. You had cadres during this period of time where you had party workers at all levels who were kind of displaying their unity to the party by looking at these small sustainable communities and getting them to produce as much as humanly possible. Because if you can produce as much as you need, then if you produce more than you can and more than you need, that shows your devotion, right? That if you are producing things to be consumed by everyone else, that your production becomes the lifeblood, and the more you create, the better party loyalist you are. This failed pretty handily, that they couldn't meet their agricultural production targets, that they couldn't do much of anything successful. And the end point of the Great Leap Forward was one of the largest and most devastating famines kind of in the history of the world, where the result of this program led to the death of a broad statistical range that you see numbers cited between 18 and 45 million people. So yeah, this sounds good, but they weren't able to do it at all. After the Cultural Revolution, or after the Great Leap Forward, you see the birth of the Cultural Revolution, another 10-year period. And it was to try and kind of hard reset China after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, to get China back to Mao's vision of the Cultural Revolution. And you would think people would blame Mao for the failure of the Great Leap Forward, but Mao made the argument that people failed, people in political positions of power failed, that it was not a failure of him, that it was a misappropriation of his philosophy. So they start targeting a bunch of different people for creating problems in China. And it was the goal of the Cultural Revolution was to purify China through struggling against class enemies. So scholars were sent to the field to work. Universities and libraries were destroyed, because if you are spending time pursuing a liberal arts education, you are not spending time producing in the name of helping China. And these, modes of education only create a new means for dividing people. So you're seeing, Mao's Little Red Guard, which were student radicals, which were children in some instances, really pointing out and targeting these class enemies. So these people were, used to kind of rat people out for doing things that were a threat to the health of China, or a threat to Mao kind of instituting his grand communist vision. Alongside the Cultural Revolution, you were seeing two other individuals, one of them being Deng Xiaoping, who will be more relevant at the start of the next lecture, starting to transition China away from some command structures and using some more market-oriented policies to kind of reinvigorate the Chinese economy. Mao was still kind of unhappy with the implementation of his vision, and he's targeting people who he thinks are a threat to Chinese progress by saying that they're taking the capitalist road, that the party was becoming corrupt and becoming bad, and that they would never be able to kind of reach his egalitarian vision. In addition to the Great Leap Forward kind of having some damaging effects in terms of population loss, the Cultural Revolution does kind of a lot to damage Chinese history, Chinese institution, and large segments of the Chinese population. The number of people who were disaffected and moved and lose, a lot of segments of their life in the name of the Cultural Revolution is really a staggering number, and these will be people that we refer to as the lost generation. when we start talking about citizen society in the state. But this video will kind of highlight some of the negative impacts of the Cultural Revolution. Mao dies, 1976. That happens, and the party is now kind of divided into four different factions. You have radicals who were led by Mao's wife, who still wanted to maintain the most radical goals of the Cultural Revolution. You had the military who wanted to push for control, and then you had moderates who were pushing for economic modernization and some development externally, or some external relations with countries to kind of push for economic development. So after Mao's death, China is kind of left in a little bit more of a political mess, that there was some, the infighting between the factions, and it almost feels like we're back to the original starting point of the first revolution in China, because people were fighting. That's it for this set of notes. In the second lecture, we'll kind of look at 1976 to now, and how the death of Mao still influences the contemporary political development of China.